Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. So again, I'm Ryan Dominguez. I'm a policy analyst at CHAPA, and I help to manage all the federal funds and all the policies that are coming through. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars that have come to the local cities and towns here in Massachusetts. So for those of you who were not at our past ARPA meetings, this may sound a little bit redundant, but I hope it acts as a little bit of a refresher for you. I will only be focusing on the fiscal recovery dollars just because this is the most flexible way that our local communities can try to meet the needs of our specific communities, and obviously eligible use will be for housing. So with so many varying needs, we're going to have to figure out creative ways to advocate with our local governments and work with different industries to ensure that the funds are used in the most kind of equitable, efficient, and effective ways. Please hold any comments that you have or any questions for the brief Q&A period that will hold after our partner at the National Low Income Housing Coalition presents. So I'll jump right in, and to start with some high-level points about the local fiscal recovery dollars. We've received around $3.4 billion to various county, city, and town governments here in Massachusetts. The total is separate from the $5 billion number that you've seen probably discussed at the state level. And eligible governments, local governments, will receive the funds at two different times. Half of it should have been sent around May, and then the other half will be sent a year later, so hopefully around May of 2022. A key point here is that the funds do have a deadline for when they have to be obligated and spent, and this makes time of the essence. All of these funds need to be obligated by the end of 2024 and spent by the end of 2026. So right now it's unknown when the state legislature will put out their plan for the funds. You know, they're currently having hearings like the one that they had last week on housing and labor and workforce and development. But they may take a little bit more time than maybe some of your cities and towns are willing to take. So since your local officials may be acting quicker than the state, it's really going to be up to each of you as local advocates to try to get involved in the process somehow and really advocate for some of these dollars to go towards housing. So on this next slide, you will see kind of the breakdown of that $3.4 billion number that I was talking about. So close to 385 million will go to non-entitlement communities, around 1.3 billion will go to different counties, and 1.7 billion will go to various towns and cities. So I've included the Treasury charts that include the breakdown to all of the local cities and towns so that you can see how much your locality is going to be received. And if you don't see your city or town on any of these charts, then they probably fall under that non-entitlement bucket, or they will receive funding through the counties when they figure out how to break that down based on need to each of the cities and towns. And we'll provide each of these slide decks with this information after this meeting. Now to touch on some of the allowable uses for these funds, there are 5 main uses for these funds. The first is to continue to support public health expenses to respond to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The second is to address negative economic impacts caused by the pandemic for various industries, including to our impact housing industry. The third is to replace lost state and local government revenue over the past year and a half. It can also be used for providing economic supports, including premium pay for essential workers, as well as investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And that may also include housing at that point. Now to touch on some of the allowable housing uses of the funds. So the American Rescue Plan Act, the interim final rule, and the guidance from the Treasury explicitly mention assistance to households as an eligible expense to respond to the negative impacts of the pandemic. This includes assistance to households, which includes rent, mortgage, or utility assistance, counseling and legal aid to prevent eviction and homelessness. And this will be particularly important now that the eviction moratorium from the CDC has passed. as well as cash assistance and food assistance. Fiscal Recovery Fund dollars can also be used to support COVID-19 prevention, mitigation, or other services in congregate living facilities, such as homeless shelters and group living facilities. It can be used for ventilation improvements in congregate settings, as well as supports for vulnerable populations, including access to medical or public health services and funding to support isolation or quarantine. The interim final rule also provides additional flexibility for governments to address the disproportionate impacts on certain communities and populations by investing in housing and neighborhoods. Services in this category can address the immediate impacts of the pandemic on housing insecurity, as well as the conditions that contributed to poor health and economic outcomes during the pandemic. And some of the eligible housing related investments here include services to address homelessness, such as supportive housing, affordable housing development to increase the supply of affordable housing, as well as housing vouchers, counseling, and housing navigation assistance to facilitate moves to more neighbors with higher levels of economic opportunity, as well as mobility for some low-income residents. So these equity-focused investments can be provided broadly to three different groups. First, they can be applied to qualified census tracts, also known as QCTs, as defined by HUD. They can be provided to families and individuals that are living in QCTs, as well as to other disproportionately impacted populations, households, or geographic areas that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And right now, there's no clarification on the definition of disproportionately impacted. But with that said, recipients will be able to define what that means for them in their specific communities, but they will have to report back with information supporting how they made that determination of how, specific populations, households, or geographic areas have been chosen as disproportionately impacted. And at CHAPA, we support targeting these flexible housing funds to households and populations that have been most impacted. And that includes people with the lowest incomes, BIPOC populations, persons with disabilities, immigrant populations, as well as LGBTQ plus populations, among other groups and other communities as well. So on the next page, I provided a number of helpful links from the Treasury, the NLIC, as well as the Mass Municipal Association, which you can use as resources in your local advocacy. They do a great breakdown of what are some of the eligible uses for these funds, as well as resources that you can look towards when you're trying to create advocacy letters or have local advocacy meetings with your local officials as well. And then finally, as you may have seen on the state level, the governor proposed allocating around $1 billion towards housing out of the $5.3 billion in aid that they've received from the state. And that equates to around 18 or 19% of the total $5.3 billion that Massachusetts has received. So in addition to that, CHAPA is requesting $683 million in addition to supporting the $1 billion ask from the governor. And we have a breakdown here of some of our priorities, but most specifically, we want this funding to go towards affordable rental housing production and preservation, housing rehabilitation projects, home ownership, public housing, acquisition, supportive housing, and housing stability. And with that said, we will be providing some more information as we develop more specifics on the implementation of some of these resources and how we can get those funds out to the most impacted communities. So that's a little bit of a brief overview of the current funds that are coming to the state. And with that, I want to pass it over to Tori Beret from the NLIC to talk a little bit about what other cities and towns are doing across the country, and maybe to help provide a little bit more context on that.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. I'm just going to show my screen because we have or share my screen. Let's see. Is there a way to share your second window? or your entire screen. Let's see. Okay, I think I figured it out. So we basically have provided a lot of guidance and to the Treasury during the during this period, especially after the American Recovery Act was passed. And so we provided guidance to make the money coming in as flexible as possible. And we've been really focusing a lot on looking at, using the American Rescue Plan Act fiscal recovery funds as leverage, because we've been seeing right now that actually only $3 billion of the, I think it was 46 or so billion that's been dedicated for emergency rental assistance has actually been used. And that's a problem, especially now that the eviction moratorium has expired. And so we actually have an opportunity with the fiscal recovery funds to leverage that, because they're so available for such a broad use. There's a lot that can be done with those funds that can support ERA programs, but that can also, like you all mentioned, build more affordable homes and preserve homes as well. So we have actually I think I can see if I can. So we have a document basically that lists all the local and states and localities that have already allocated ARPA fiscal recovery funds for housing purposes. And it's a really good advocacy resource, and a lot of our folks actually at the state and local level have used it. I'm going to see if I can share that specific document with you. And so this is the document that myself and a colleague put together. So we're looking at which states have passed again budgets that have used the ARPA money for housing, and you can see there's a really broad array. So from like Alaska to Colorado to Connecticut, Utah. So there's a broad array of states that have passed this money, and then a broad array of what they are using this money for, from using it for utility assistance to California is using it a lot to build affordable homes that are already in their pipeline. They have some money set aside for homelessness grants, for affordable housing preservation, for eviction and foreclosure prevention, as well as for legal assistance. And then some other states are more broad. So Colorado, the money is just going to their it's going to their affordable housing and homeownership cash fund, which will then be distributed to organizations. And Pennsylvania is pretty broad in that respect as well, where their money is going to the State Housing Finance Agency, which will then release an a request for proposals and make the determination based on the proposals that come in. So that's a state programs. And then in terms of the local programs, again, a lot of localities are also using this money for housing. And so there's a lot of examples here in which they're using it for legal assistance to help folks that are experiencing homelessness, for affordable housing trust fund, for motel vouchers, congregate and non-congregate shelter, rental assistance, and rapid rehousing. So again, this is a broad array, and you can see there's a lot of the localities are setting aside 15, 16.
Oops. Tori, you accidentally muted.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. And so you can see that there's a lot of these localities too have set aside a significant degree of money, like Louisville, Kentucky, 16 million. So This is, again, a resource that's available online, and I can pop it in the chat. So we also, just in terms of looking at what other aspects of advocacy you conduct. So a lot of our partners are conducting needs assessments, actually. So our partners in Utah, we're creating a needs assessment to then bring to their state to make the case for why they need these funds. A lot of, especially at the federal level, but I think even at the state level, some folks are asking, why this money is needed. Why do you want more money for housing? We already have all this money for housing. And, we're seeing in a lot of cases that, again, their needs, the lowest income folks and the people with the highest needs aren't being targeted. They're not getting the resources that they need. And in addition, there was a huge problem even before the pandemic. So that, again, is why these funds are so important. But I think making the case through a needs assessment, or our partners in Maine actually used eviction data from the top populated cities in Maine, making the case for specific legislation and resources to come to the state. And then I think a lot of different partners and folks have been collecting stories, and I know we're going to be starting to collect stories too of folks who need direct assistance and are being evicted. And I think obviously getting permission to share those stories is really important, but I think being able to show the direct impact of real people being affected by the eviction moratorium expired, by doing everything they can, using credit cards, everything else, and still not being able to stay in their home or afford their rent, I think is really important to share as well. And a lot of what we do, and I know a lot of our partners do as well, is we write letters in terms of documenting what's needed in terms of resources and send that to the administration or legislators, and that can certainly be done and has been done at the state and local levels to make the case for what this money can do in terms of housing at the local level. And I think always remembering to, you can reach out to your local legislators and set up a brief meeting and talk about in person the need. I think just having a sit down for 20-30 minutes where you're able to make the case to them, I think can be really effective. So those are just a couple reminders. And I think also I just want to briefly show a resource that we have, another resource that we have, which is available online, and that is, so this is more data. So in terms of looking at, if we're saying we want to use the ARPA money to be leveraged for ensuring that the ERA money is getting out the door, we have a list of what the states have been able to allocate and distribute. So what was allocated to them, and then what's been distributed so far. So Massachusetts has distributed about 20% of ERA $1 so far. And actually, sadly, they're on the higher end of states that are performing. And then we also have this for community and our local programs as well. So we have a list of localities that we have access to their database and have listed that online as well. So I can also share that resource in the chat. And then this is the database that we have a link to. So this is the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development database, and they list all of the ERA programs, and you can click on each one and see how much was allocated when, and how they're doing in terms of that performance. So that might also be helpful in terms of the data side of making your point, again, about why these additional funds are needed to leverage that money. So I think that's my contact information. That's it for what I have to share.
Thank you so much, Tori and Ryan. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so maybe we can go through those. And then if folks have additional questions, you can either put it in the chat or raise your virtual hand so that I can call on you. So just the first one in the chat was a question about county allocations. What does that mean given the lack of real county level government here in Massachusetts?
Sorry, I meant to say locality. So it's looking at like cities and wherever there's a program, basically. And unfortunately, so this is another actually advocacy piece, is that a lot of these programs are not making the data available, which is a huge problem, right? Because if we can't see who the data is serving and if it's meeting the needs of the lowest income folks, we don't know if it's being accurately targeted. And so we, on our website, make available the programs that do have public dashboards. And I think it's important to see, we also list all of the programs in each state. So you can see again what's available online for your programs, and that there needs to be more data available so that we can make sure that these funds are accurately targeted. And in a lot of cases, they aren't, like I said, have that data. So.
Great. And Ryan, you had shared some county level data as well.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off of what Tori said and just say that, you know, one of the things that is happening here on the Massachusetts state level is that, yes, we do not have county level governments. So what has been talked about, and obviously like this is just what we've been hearing a little bit, and there's not actually a process that's in place just yet, that for areas where there's not a county level government, that the state was going to do kind of that needs assessment and allocate the dollars to different cities and towns. Obviously that process hasn't been fleshed out just yet, but that is what we're hearing. And then for places where there is a county government, then the cities and towns would be working potentially through like an RFP process with that county government to get some of those funds.
Thank you. Another question in the chat is there data on mortgage assistance utilization versus rental assistance that you had shared? Anywhere that they might access that?
We've been hearing from folks that the mortgage, so we focus on the lowest income renters, so we tend not to look at mortgage data. I had heard on I think a webinar last week that I was on, that the mortgage assistance money has not been utilized very much. But I can see if I can pull that source up.
Thank you, Tori.
Yeah, no problem.
Appreciate it. We have another question. Can the funds be used for an individual development account or IDA specifically to save for a down payment?
I don't know. That's actually a good question. I know the money is pretty broad, but I'm not sure about that specifically.
Okay, and we'll be taking notes of these questions, folks.
Okay, good.
Anything that we can't answer, we have it all in the chat, and we will work to get those questions.
Excellent.
Okay, so let me see if I have any other additional questions. So folks had already asked about whether there was data available by municipality. And I think you shared what there is available, Tori.
Right, yeah. I think, actually, I don't know if I did or not. So let me just look for that and I can pop it in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, any other questions? I don't see any hands raised, but any other questions in the chat? Is there a definition of the most or disproportionately impacted families?
So I think we're looking at folks that are in the lowest income, so 30% AMI or below. But that's something that we're asking more clarity on from the Treasury Department about how they're defining impacted communities and impacted families.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And one more question popped in. How are housing advocates able to obtain some of these resources to do outreach to tenants in need of preventing eviction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, I think it would be, that's a tricky one. I think it depends on the, I guess, in terms of how the government is going to distribute the funds, and then if they're distributing, you know, so if there is an RFP process, then organizations could apply directly. And I think, making we're encouraging a lot of programs to work with nonprofits and on the outreach side. So, because a lot of nonprofits are often connected to a lot of different folks in the community. So I think if that's an option, then hopefully you'd be able to send in a proposal with that suggestion. But yeah, that's a great point.
Thanks for that. And just to add on, part of CHAPA's proposal in that housing stability priority that we have of 83 million, we're actually asking for $5 million for tenant outreach and housing assistance that will go specifically to community-based organizations and groups. We'll see how successful we are in advocating for that at the state level. But I will keep you updated as well, Tori, and the rest of the group on how those efforts go.
That's great. That would be great. And I did finally, I found the link to the document that shows what's being utilized in Massachusetts so far or spent down. So hopefully that will help.
Thank you, Tori. One more question. Considering that many smaller communities are receiving considerably less than $1 million, can they pool their funds to support eviction prevention or some of these other efforts?
That's also a good question that I don't know the answer to. That's another one that I can follow up with you on. I don't know if there's, the Treasury unfortunately has been pretty vague in a lot of these guidances, but that's definitely a good question that we can follow up with them on.
Great. And I see a couple of hands raised, so I'm going to go to Carol Marine from CHAPA. Go ahead, Carol.
Hi, Dana, thank you. I just wanted to comment that CHAPA and many other community-based organizations and advocacy groups have given input and comment to the state for the Housing Assistance Fund. And a big issue that has come up that we have advocated for with many of our partners is to include community-based organizations that are well-connected in the community, can help with the outreach and access to all of those funds to help stabilize households and prevent displacement. You can look on the mass.gov website and see the HAF implementation plan for those who are interested, and I can put the link up.
Thank you, Carol. And I see Laura Massey also has her hand raised.
Thanks. Sorry, okay, trying to get my hand out. So for one thing, I'm really glad to hear that CHAPA is advocating about partnering with community-based organizations. That kind of goes to the question I have for Tori. But Tori, as you know, we've had some concerns about how the ERA rollout has gone in Massachusetts, both in terms of making the best use of the funds and in terms of kind of bureaucratic disenfranchisement sort of hurdles that they make it harder for the most marginalized, lowest income households to be able to access the resources. And again, we're also thinking about that in terms of what are object lessons we can draw from the ERA rollout to inform what we want to see the state and localities doing with ARPA funds. But I'm wondering, in addition to just the sort of what are the allowable uses under ARPA and what are the uses for which we'd want to advocate, I wonder if you have thoughts about sort of conditions that we might want to advocate for to be attached to those allocations in order to maximize utility, particularly for the most marginalized populations.
That's a great question, Laura. And I'm sorry, my cat is throwing around his food bowl, so that's probably what you might be hearing in the background because he wants more food. Yeah, so I think we would advocate that they be targeted to 80% AMI or below in terms of like who those funds are serving, as well as BIPOC populations. And I think that also, yeah, so I would say that those are probably the primary recommendations we would make. And then we have a lot of recommendations for, how programs can improve and reports on that and case studies and lots of details on that. So, but I think there's an issue of like being able to connect with the folks that are operating these programs and provide that information. So.
Thank you so much, Tori. I know you have to run to another meeting. There's a lot going on this week in particular and just the last few weeks, but we really appreciate you being with us. Ryan is going to stay with us to answer questions in the chat. But for questions that we haven't been able to get to, we are going to try to keep putting out as much information as possible. So we'll say thank you and goodbye to you, Tori.
Bye, thanks so much.
Thanks, Tori.
Appreciate it.
Really
Have a good
appreciate
one.
it.
Sure.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
And then Ryan will stick around and answer some questions in the chat. But I will move on to our next item on the agenda, which is I'm going to be talking a little bit about what advocacy you can be doing locally, and then we're going to hear from some of our local partners on what they are working on at their municipal level. So I just want to make a couple of comments for all of you. As you're pulling together, there's so much information that Ryan and Tori were able to share with you all. There's a lot that you need to be looking at. We will be doing our best to make the materials concise and easy to read through. And there's lots of links that we're sharing in the chat. We will also be sharing all of those via email afterwards. So if you haven't been grabbing all of those as we go along, please don't feel pressure to do that. I wanted to highlight a couple of things that I think will be helpful for you all in making your own case at the local level for how to use these funds. We have a bunch of really wonderful resources here in Massachusetts that we rely on and have been relying on throughout the last year. We're going to share those in the chat, but the first place I go for my housing research is Datatown. It's a good primer on how many people in your community might have housing costs, housing needs, things of that sort. The Greater Boston Housing Report Card that came out this past year is a really wonderful resource. It gets into some of the really deep details of what you may be needing to make the case for who was disproportionately impacted and how that's impacted your community. There was a great memo that came out of Mass Budget, some guidance on how to use these funds to create sustainable, equitable, and community-driven processes. So I would encourage folks to check that out. And then very early on, MAPC started putting together data around the impacts of COVID and layoffs on our housing gaps. And I think that's a really great source for folks to lean into as you're trying to think about how you want to make the case at the local level. A couple of other things I just want to encourage you all to do as you're starting to think of this, or as you're continuing to think about this, is build a big tent. That's what we encourage at the Municipal Engagement Initiative always, is to kind of have as many people in your advocacy group as possible. Yes, we're advocating for money for housing, but we know that this is a far-reaching issue. There's people who have been working with folks around food security, around childcare security, around transit security, building that tent out for your advocacy so that you're all working in tandem will be important. And I would encourage you to think about what you've been wanting to do locally that you haven't been able to do for lack of funds and resources. So many of your communities have a housing production plan or a master plan, or you've had applications for Community Preservation Act funds that you haven't been able to fulfill. So I would encourage you to check out, what do you already have that you've been wanting to do? What might these resources be able to allow you to do going forward that you haven't before? I would also encourage folks to check out the Housing Toolbox and the localhousingsolutions.org. I'll put those links into the chat as well. These are, if you're thinking about innovative programs that other communities have that you've been wanting to explore that might fit the needs, these are good places for you to start thinking about it. And I also just want to, I think that we have heard this kind of in all of our conversations about this, but to really think big picture goals, everything that you're doing and you're proposing, think about it from a perspective of equity, systemic issues, sustainability. Are you making more inclusive communities? Is it community driven? Ensuring that the disparities that you're that have been exacerbated by COVID are being addressed, because these are all the kinds of things that we can make an impact with using these funds. We don't want to exacerbate any of these disparities. And lastly, we're going to hear from a couple of communities who have already started thinking about this and doing the work. But if you don't know what to do with your funds, all I can ask you is to not do nothing. Do something. If it's even just a letter to your local elected officials and local municipal staff highlighting the need for some of the money that will be coming into your community for housing, noting what some of the eligible uses are and encouraging them to make a significant investment in housing through this process, that is a good place to start. Get it on the radar of folks who will be making these decisions, as you'll see from our local folks who are going to be talking in just a second. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to some of our local communities. We're going to hear from Brookline, Amherst, and Worcester. They've all started thinking about and advocating for what they want to use their ARPA funds for in their municipalities. So we'll start with Deborah Brown from Brookline. Deborah, if you could unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. And you know, everything I've heard so far is really relevant to the presentation I want to make. One of the things that I want to highlight about Brookline is, one, that it's a town, and two, it's an affluent town. And when you have an affluent community, one of the things that I noticed is that you have to get people to agree that your town actually has disadvantaged people. And so if your select board or your elected officials believe that the truly disadvantaged are a small outlier, then I think it becomes much more difficult to access resources. Second thing I want to mention is you've got to get prepared. And by being prepared, I mean you've got to form some sort of loose-knit organization or tightly knit organization that actually allows you to do the kind of lobbying that's important. And one of the things that we did is we sent a letter to our select board saying that you need a community engagement process. And here's what we're proposing. It was one page, very simple, but the response from our select board was, well, thank you. And so it's on the agenda for select board tomorrow night to get the ball rolling. But the thing about that, before we even got to that letter, we had 5 different people that were thinking about different aspects of how you get a larger group of people involved. And that's morphing into many more people. The other thing that's important is you need a champion among your elected officials. You need at least, and hopefully it's the highest ranking elected official. And that means you need to lobby that person. You need to lobby that person with data. And it may mean that you need to say, why don't you come tour your public housing with me? Why don't you come to a certain neighborhood? Because even, I get very insulated and very comfortable with my living situation. But it's important for them to see it and understand that this is, people talk about climate change as an existential crisis. If you have no housing in a time of COVID, you have an existential crisis. So I know, Dana, my time is winding down, but I did want to hit on a few things. The engagement has to be robust, and you have to be thinking about, in Brookline, there are 3 categories of funding, and that's going to be the non-discretionary, which is COVID response money, government services, and that's the restoration of COVID cuts. I don't think Brookline's going to have many, but you have to pay attention because, a lot of money can get sucked into that. And the last thing is community initiatives. Well, if your community hasn't been thinking about any kinds of priorities, it may be hard to start this conversation, but I think it's essential. And, we've talked about design charrettes, we've talked about surveys, forums, using social media to spread the word out and get people actually to start talking about these issues. In terms of priorities, I always start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in an incredibly intellectual town like Brookline, Maslow may resonate more than the idea that there are people actually hungry in this town. But you've got to get people where they are to point out that little Johnny doesn't do well in school if he doesn't, or she, or he, that they don't have safe housing. And so there are ways that you've just got to beat that drum over and over and over again. Lastly, one of the things that we figured out that we needed to do, because our town does not have a community engagement structure as such to be effective, is we went to our Brookline Community Foundation. And the Brookline Community Foundation has done a lot of outreach, that's done a needs assessment in the past, said, yeah, we'll take this on. We'll be the focal point for figuring out how we get this message out to people. We'll help you figure out how you're going to analyze particular applications that come in. The beauty of this is, you know, when the government does it, sometimes the applications are so complex that maybe you'll lose 70, 80% of the people that might apply. But if you've got an NGO that just hits, you know, they get to the guts of the matter, then you're allowing people time to actually think about what they want to do versus responding to questions. And anybody that's done a CDBG, Community Development Block Grant application, knows what I'm talking about. So, you know, we're looking at food, housing, repairs to housing, new construction. These are my pet issues. Elimination of lead paint. And you can get lead pipes out, but paint is the thing, you know, my experience in New England, where you change or ruin young people's lives. Mold in the older buildings. I mean, I think these are things that, you know, for me, that become really important. And outcome measures. The federal government, having worked in the federal government, likes nothing better than for people to be able to say, we built X number, or we removed X number of pounds of pollution, but to be as specific as you can about what it is you can do. So I want to thank you for your time, but Brookline, I think, is actually, we're on it. And I think the government is excited, the town government is excited about this process as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And we did share in the chat your presentation, which has a lot of information. So I would definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. So next we're going to hear from John Hornick from Amherst.
Thanks, Dana. I am John Hornick. I am chair of the Amherst Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. And I guess a month or more, I learned, of course, that there was money coming to the town. And I believe the total Amherst will receive is around $9 million. And so I began to think about, well, how can we use that for affordable housing? We have another number of projects that might get into the pipeline. One that just received funding from the Department of Housing and Community Development. But I was concerned that we couldn't necessarily start something that would be obligated and completed by the deadlines in 2024 and 26. So I was trying to think about what else can we do, and particularly something for which there's unlikely no other source of funding. So I actually sent a proposal to the town manager, and Dana, if you could put that on the screen, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. That is something that I hope when our housing trust meets next week, that we'll all recommend, although I can see other things happening. Part of the reason I wanted to participate in this was because I really had no good idea about whether this reasonably would fit with the requirements for spending ARPA funds. So I'm encouraged by what Ryan and Tori said. I think it looks like this might indeed be fit eligible uses. This is going to be much narrower than what you just heard from Deborah, what you'll hear next about Worcester. But I think our job really is to look at affordable housing. So there's lots of units that are rental units. I think more than half of Amherst population are in rental units, and they operate often very poorly. They use well outdated heating systems. It means the air quality isn't good, so there are health issues. The comfort level isn't very good. and there are high costs both to renters and landlords. So what I'm going to suggest we do is to subsidize the cost of retrofitting rental housing units by putting in heat pump technology in all of these, or I won't say all of them, but in many of these buildings. My estimate, which isn't mine, but comes from another source, is that it will cost us around $10,000 for a unit, and that would include weatherization and replacement of the present technology. The primary targets would be older buildings in which the landlord pays the cost of central heating, so that the landlord will also have savings. Talk to the town commissioner, and there's more need out there than we'd probably be able to. So there's some agreement, I would say, that this is something that we could do. As I think Rachel mentioned earlier, in Massachusetts, the governor wants to spend 20% of state ARPA funds on housing. And so I'm going to suggest that's a reasonable goal for the town as well. There is a local group, actually their state group, called the Center for Eco-Technology. And I've talked to them, and we can leverage these funds. Eversource, which is the major electrical provider in this area, also is committed to making these kinds of changes, to making places more efficient and to changing the heating technology. But they're falling behind in their own implementation goals. So working with the Center for Eco-Technology, we believe we can get a commitment from Eversource to throw in money to cover some of the costs of the changes, so we would be matching or leveraging the ARPA funds. They also will do a number of other things potentially for us. They'll do pre and post assessments of the impact. They will work with landlords to find appropriate contractors to undertake the work, and also work with the town to figure out a fair way to allocate the funds. While we generally tend to focus on the larger landlords, this program wouldn't necessarily be restricted to them. So I'm assuming that these sources from ARPA and Eversource would largely finance this effort. That means landlords aren't going to have to pay very much, if anything, to get this done. So they'd be expected to reduce rents, to switch over so that the tenants are responsible for their individual electric utility payments, which they now would have control over, and they don't currently. The other thing I didn't mention earlier, but as another goal, is as part of making a deal with landlords, I'd like to be able to negotiate an increase in the number of affordable units, so we expand the number of affordable housing units in the town. There are other potential sources of funding, which I don't need to go into. We are expecting to partner in this with a town council committee on environment and climate change. We actually partnered with them in doing a forum on climate and housing back in May. And so part of this is an opportunity to take advantage of what we learned in that forum and to assure that we have them as a partner in this effort. If you go to Datatown and look at Amherst, you'll find that many more, over 50% of Amherst renters are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And for a smaller but still substantial number, over 50% of their income goes on housing. So all of this also make housing more affordable for people. So that's briefly what I have in mind. I did send this to our town manager. He sent me a brief note back saying, well, we'll let you know when we figure out what the process is for receiving proposals. And so I'll be waiting. But in the meantime, I'll be talking to other people in the Housing Trust, and we'll decide whether formally to recommend this to the town and looking for other allies to advocate for this in the process.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate your thought on this and sharing with everyone. And we did share in the chat the document that John was referring to, the proposal to subsidize the cost of this in Amherst. So next we're going to go to Atel from the city of Worcester. Atel, if you could unmute yourself and join us, that'd be great.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, CHAPA. And John, would love to connect with you separately as Worcester is launching an affordable housing trust fund. So this is a really unique opportunity for us and a little bit making our path as we go here. So by way of introduction, I'm the co-chair of the Worcester Housing Together housing subgroup. This is a group of folks that has met throughout the pandemic to address issues of homelessness and housing. We decided that as soon as the news broke out regarding the ARPA funds and the allocation that Worcester received, which is over $110 million, that we needed to put our heads together to figure out both how do we partner with the city to launch this affordable housing trust fund, very new initiative for us, as well as leverage the ARPA funds. So this is a new journey for us, and sort of where we started is with a group of 38 folks that represent a diverse experiences in Worcester, including housing, folks who work with faith congregations, housing advocates, folks who have been interested in affordable housing before. We brought them together to simply say, we have this opportunity to have an affordable housing trust fund. We not really clear how the city plans to fund it. We don't have a Community Preservation Act or inclusionary zoning. It seems like getting good head starts with the ARPA funds is a good way to start it. We, to the city's credit, we did get word from them that the city manager was thinking about allocating some funds to the trust fund. We weren't super clear as to how much, so we organized quickly. We got word out in the community, drafted a letter to say, could you please put 20% of the total ARPA funds into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, given that we have no clarity, A, how it's going to get funded in the future or sustained, and B, it seems to us like a great opportunity to build a really strong trust fund. That letter yielded around 28 signatories. This includes anchor institutions like UMass, housing organizations that are working with children and families. Like Dana said, we're trying to build a big tent. We also don't want to neglect the fact that the voices and experiences of folks who have either experienced homelessness or have experience with eviction and housing instability are super important to this effort. So we're building efforts to create a speakers assembly alongside this effort to make sure that we're creating a big tent and centering the voices of those who are mostly disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. This group of people that we have put together is meeting weekly. Even though our focus has been to advocate for 20% or roughly $23 million to go into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we also are doing our due diligence. Like John was just mentioning ahead of us, we don't have an experience with having a housing trust fund, whether these funds can be obligated and expended by 2026, whether we want to use it for acquisition of properties, or actually how it can work and whether it's effective. So we started with 20% thanks to CHAPA's recommendation because we felt like we needed to start somewhere. Currently, the city manager proposed $12 million to housing. This includes public housing, housing and safety net, and de-letting efforts. There's talk about rehabilitating units. What's missing in this conversation for us is that there's been no process. There's been no discussion around how to involve communities. Someone was mentioning, the speaker before us was mentioning, Deborah was mentioning before that there needs to be a transparent process and engage the community in assessing what these priorities are. All we know is these vague categories, and we are taking this opportunity to not just talk about housing, but also have a larger conversation around how does Worcester also replicate wage theft ordinance, into the ARPA funds for construction? How do we make sure that we're hiring local people? How do we make sure that BIPOC communities and low-income communities are centered in all of the discussions? That's where our organizing efforts are centered right now. We're hoping, like somebody said, lobbying your elected officials. We've already talked to the head of the Economic Development Subcommittee that will look at the trust fund, but we're certainly looking at building broad support, elected and not elected, so that this becomes a community conversation. And I think I'm gonna close with the fact that I think one of the opportunities that at least we see for Worcester is that this has opened up a whole conversation, a renewed conversation on what affordable housing means, who is mostly being left out of this conversation. And we're hoping that we can take whatever organizing and coalition building that we have and we keep it sustained for the future, because we don't believe that the eviction crisis or the housing crisis is going to end even with the ARPA money in the fold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atel. I really appreciate all of you guys sharing what you guys are working on and grappling with. And so we're going to give some time for everyone in the meeting to do that. So thank you for bearing with us. I know we got started a little bit late, but I do want to, normally in our Making the Case calls, we try to hear from all of you. With this many people, we're going to send you into some breakout groups for about 10 minutes. You'll be in a small group, and I have some discussion questions. Hi, sorry, my daughter's trying to, we're getting all of the potential Zoom issues here, daughters and issues. 1 second, sweetie, I'll be done talking in 1 minute, okay? So I'm gonna put in the chat a document that has some small group discussion questions and instructions. We really do want you all to be taking notes, because you'll see in the discussion questions, there's some things we want to learn from you. And we know a lot of questions have come up that you have been asking of us. We want to be able to answer them as we go forward. So if you can make sure to have one person in your group take some notes, even just on a Word document, you'll email it to me afterwards. We would appreciate that, so we can follow up with you. So I'm going to be sending you into your breakout rooms now. And we will come back, we will reconvene in about 10 minutes, but quickly, the things we're going to be looking to talk about is, what are you exploring for the use of your ARPA funds? What are some of the questions you have remaining about eligibility? What do you need to make your case? So there were some questions about data that you might want access to in order to talk to your local officials. And what are some additional challenges that you are facing in your community? So we will start those breakout groups right now. And Ryan is also going to stay out of the breakout groups. If you have any questions specifically about eligibility of funds, we'll hopefully have Ryan pop into your group and hopefully be able to answer those questions for you. So about 10 minutes, we'll see you back here after that. Welcome back, everyone. All right, so everyone should be coming back in from the meeting, the breakout rooms.
That wasn't nearly enough time.
I know. That's why I really encourage you guys to take questions, or to put down your questions, because we really do want to hear from all of you. So I've still got some folks who are, I think, coming back from the rooms. Okay, it looks like everyone is back in from the rooms, and we definitely wanted you all to take some time to write down your questions, but I wanted to use just the little bit of time that we have left to see, you know, share out, were there any great ideas that you learned from your co-breakout room partners, or any big questions that you still haven't had answered that you really want to make sure you ask, or things that you need from us in order to make your case locally? Claire, I see your hand is raised. You can go. Oh, there you go.
I got it. We made 2 points. One is that this money times out, and some of the solutions I don't think we're even going to be able to get to before the money times out. So is there advocacy at the federal level to have this be more patient, the money to be more patient? I'm really worried about that. And using it for things that are more permanent. You know, if you do rental subsidy, the rental subsidy goes away. right? So, and that's just going to kick the can down the road. So that was one issue. And the second, I was struck by what John Hornick talked about in terms of doing energy weatherization and so on. And we're actually getting ARPA money to do that too in my agency. We're a community action agency. So it's coordinating with partners that have that money through another silo another silo and trying to collaborate with those partners and have them manage those programs. But the big challenge for us in the nonprofit world, as people are throwing money like we've never seen before at us, is being able to hire to get that done. And I know on the contractor side, all the energy people are flat out. It's really, and we had a window project for one of our Head Start sites. We're probably going to be 6 months behind on getting those windows done at the end of the day. So what does that mean for this money that's going to go away?
Yeah, really great points. Thank you, Claire. And I had heard a question in the chat earlier about kind of the impacts on the cost of construction and just the slowdowns in that and how that will impact. So thank you for raising that. Other comments, ideas that were shared. So Jude is saying the guidelines are ambiguous and misleading. We need more time to think about them. Is there possible request more time for communities to meet and talk? Yeah, good question. So needing a little more time for your communities to grapple with what you want to do. Jess, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, Jess.
Sorry, let me put my hand down real quick. So in our group, some things that were discussed are providing housing related financial assistance to low income people or supplement rental assistance for programs that are like already existing, and also for heating and housing related costs, housing search related costs, and also to help sort of cover the costs for projects that are already in motion but are not going to reach sort of their deadline that they already have probably pre-COVID because of COVID. Also legal assistance for residents. That was brought up. Unfortunately, that's something that was cut off. She was in the middle of speaking because we had to come back here. But there's those things. I know where I live in Somerville that we have brought things up like, housing security for immigrants and undocumented people, programs for, careers and self-sufficiency, the job, market for people of low income, where especially we don't have or may not have a lot of experience, is even more difficult. And you would think that, places being shut down and then reopening would open up plenty of opportunities for us, but that's not exactly the way it works when it's competitive with even more people. So there's that. And also just like the funding of, like I said, projects that are already in the process, like our Clarendon, for instance, which has been on hold now since the beginning of the shutdowns. So.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate you sharing all those questions and comments and concerns. Seeing a lot of questions in the chat. Some groups said, they have mostly questions. So we will do our best to either answer those or find resources to send them to. One question that was sent to me directly, but this question I wanted to raise for all of you is how to advocate for a public input on how funds should be spent, given that there's not really a requirement for this. And people are really trying to get funds out as quickly as possible. So, I think that this is what, Deborah was talking about, pulling together an advocacy group and getting out there quickly and saying, this is what we want. We want to make sure there's a community engagement process, leaning into the advocates you can, talking to the champions that you can. I don't know, Ryan, if there's anything you want to add to that, but I do think it is important to say we want a process. We want to get this money out there and we want to use it quickly, but we also want to make sure it's going to the most important sources of funds that we need.
Yeah, I don't have anything really more to add. It's just that the communities that you have seen, like the NLIC has provided today in terms of like the cities and towns, a lot of the housing advocates were able to get involved in the process pretty early and talking with their city managers and their local elected officials to talk about how housing was very important. So I think that, you know, in any case that we can also do that here in Massachusetts with our local advocacy, I think that would be really important, especially with the fact that we're not quite sure yet when the state will put out their plans for allocating the dollars. So again, your city and town processes may be moving a lot faster than that.
I know we're going to lose some folks in a couple of minutes because we started a few minutes late. I am going to keep us on for a few, but before I do start to lose folks at 3 o'clock, I wanted to just share, we are going to be sending you a Google form, and it's also in the chat here. We're trying to gather as much information as possible on what local communities are thinking about, what they are proposing. So you can take a look at that Google form and submit it, and hopefully we'll be able to compile as much information as possible. So just want to make sure to share that with folks before we start to lose people. I see a couple of dittos and a couple of pieces of feedback in the chat here. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing that. Jess, your hand is up again. Are you wanting to comment again, or did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just briefly want to say I am a tenant leader for Clarendon Residents United, and as far as the community engagement process, I think it's important for, you know, organizations and, you know, local leadership to engage the public housing communities, specifically tenant leaders, in order to start the discussion and figure out what it is that everybody has, you know, been having issues with and what problems that they're facing. And also, we have at our housing authority, when we receive notice of rent arrearages, they give us the resources attached to that. So they're not just saying you owe this much, they're saying you owe this much, but you have the opportunity to get rent relief funds and stuff like that.
Thank you, Jess. And Deborah, I think you wanted to make a comment as well.
Yeah, very quickly, you know, in a town, the town meeting form of government, typically at some point priorities seem to percolate up to the top. So the last 2-3 town meetings, it's been affordable housing in Brookline and food security. And so part of our argument will be that, at least for purposes of our elected officials, we've had a conversation around priorities. Clearly, it needs to be expanded much more broadly. But it's a way for people who are actually in towns, if you can look at what's been coming up, to make that part of, you know, sort of the basis for your argument that housing is important.
Thank you, Deborah. Any other questions? I see a lot of folks sharing information in the chat, which I really appreciate. And like I said, if you were the person taking notes for your group, please email those directly to me, dlewinter@chapa.org. We are going to compile them. We're going to do our best to provide resources to all of you. I hear everyone is wanting information, and I appreciate that you all are working on this at the local level. I want to just say thank you for all of you for sticking with us through this session, to Ryan and Tori and John and Deborah and Atel for speaking. Really appreciate you all being with us. I'm going to share one more thing in the chat. We do Affordable Housing 101 sessions. I know you all know housing and you are your local advocates. We found that a big tool in bringing more people into the conversation is making sure they know what you're talking about, that they know all of the terms and they know all of the resources and all of the things that might be out there. Several of you who are on this call have taken this with us. So please pass it on, and it's open to anyone. It's free. It's interpreted simultaneously into Spanish. So if you've been talking with folks and they say, I want to be involved in affordable housing advocacy, but I just don't know where to start, that might be a good place to send them. So I really appreciate you all being here. And thanks again so much for joining us. Have a great day. Eileen, you want to say goodbye?